Welcome to another JJ in the Field. Timely agronomic tips when you need them most. I'm Jonah Johnson. Today we're in northern Pickaway County, and we were made aware of the field that we are in today about 4 weeks ago, where a grower was doing some post-application of some micronutrients and some herbicide applications, as we all do this time of year. And he noted to Brian Reeb, our research agronomist, who was with him at the day, saying that I have this patch in my field that every year when I have them in soybeans, so every other year, I get what you see behind me here. And we flew the drone and took some great aerial photography to show, and it really defines this historical pattern of this micronutrient deficiency that we have here behind us. And so here behind me in the surrounding area is a very severe manganese deficiency. And so manganese deficiency, shows up with that interveinal chlorosis. So if my hand is the leaf vein, you get very vibrant green veins in the leaf itself, but in between all around, the plant can turn multiple shades of light green, in this case severe yellow, and where we get severe stunting. And so last week we took some tissue samples and corresponding soil samples and sent those to the lab to confirm this, because at this severity all around me, we could almost think that this also could be an iron deficiency, or IDC, iron deficiency chlorosis. East of the Mississippi River, we don't deal with that. Manganese is our primary nutrient type this time of year. When you get into higher pH soils, calcareous soils, that's where they run into iron problems. So when you get out west of the Mississippi River, you get into Iowa and the greater part of the Corn Belt, they'll see more of that issue. But back to our story here. So we did our sampling, our destructive sampling, and found out that they did correlate to what we suspicion it was, a very severe manganese deficiency here. So manganese deficiency, a lot of times guys, throw that, manganese is an important micronutrient in the plant. We like that nutrient to be applied typically earlier in the growing season, around the vegetative stages when you're doing typically your post-application of herbicides, to have these type of micronutrients robust enough within the system of the plant. So when it hits reproduction, that's not going to be a limiting factor, because when we're trying to catch up and apply, sometimes we may not always meet sufficiency, if you will. But foliar nutrition at a timely, when we start to see a transition to showing deficiency, we can supply enough nutrition foliarly to meet that plant's demand as we go into reproduction. Where manganese kind of got its hallmark of nutrient in the press, if we go back a decade and a half, back in the mid-2000s. So back then, the glyphosate applications, for our Roundup days and beans, before we got into our multiple herbicide stack traits, glyphosate was depended on quite solely, and at that time we were using exorbitant higher rates. And so it was very common for guys to talk about, I see yellow flash in my beans, or I might have had some in the corners, we had some overlap, or exorbitant high rates. And so that's a different beast from the manganese. So we can see yellow flashing in beans. That's the compounds breaking down as that plant has to detoxify that glyphosate molecule, and then for it to stay alive as it grows. Manganese deficiency got its tie into the glyphosate application, because a lot of times when we see manganese flash, it was figured out that there is glyphosate has the ability to tie up manganese. So manganese, if you remember back to some of our winter meetings and some of our earlier videos, we talked about that's a positive charged cation. Glyphosate's a negative charge, and so if you have that in a spray tank, it can actually, they're attracted to each other, and it actually can chelate it and keep that from actually being released to the plant foliarly. To take that a step further, when you think about high rates of glyphosate in our fields, in those plants and the weeds themselves, it's a systemic herbicide where it's got its fame from roots to shoots. When it gets into the soil, the roots exudate, it passes that glyphosate off into the soil as it exudes that through the roots. And you think about, as we talk about soil health, which I'm a big proponent of trying to increase on farms, when we have those microbial populations in the soil, that's very toxic, that glyphosate. So you have plants, roots that are exuding glyphosate from processing that. Then you have weeds that are around those plants exuding glyphosate. That's a very toxic compound to these microbes in the soil. So those microbes are responsible for reducing, through the redox process and the soil chemistry, making manganese available to the soil. So in that aspect, you can have microbial death and populations reduced, where we're not getting manganese released in the soil naturally. And then you can also, so you're having that below ground, but then you can also have it above ground by chelating in the tank. And so the best way to get around that is to actually make your post herbicide applications separate from your manganese applications. So in this case here, the best case scenario would have been to apply your herbicides, come back 7 to 10 days later and apply your foliar nutrition. Now obviously that's not what most growers want to have to do when they have a lot of acres of coverage, and I totally realize that. But when we're looking at severe cases like that, these are things that we're going to have to consider in the future to try to meet these plants' needs. So based on, you'll see in the aerial photography that this is a very definitive zone. In this area here, it's a very black sandy type soil type. When we get away from these, there's a transitional zone or it's not as bad, but then when we get further away, it goes away. And the grower noticed this every other year in soybeans. Now, was it a problem in corn? Yes, it was, but corn can deal better with the absence of manganese to a point. And especially when you got erratic pHs, that the grass crops take pH changes better than soybeans. So in this case here, in this type of severity, it's going to be hard to bring these back, but we are going to do some foliar treatments today with Brian Reba, research agronomist, and see if we inflict some treatments out here, can we turn any of these around? My suspicion here in these very bad yellow stunted areas, the damage has been done, but we have transitional zones around us that we're all going to target and see what we can bring back to life, if you will. So going forward, some summary points here that manganese typically shows up later in the season. Now we're in the middle of August, dry weather, dry soils. Temperature can inflict this to some degree, of course, if you have low manganese in our soils. There's been some research at Purdue and other universities that suggests banding manganese at planting, but that's maybe not always as easy to do, depending on what your planting situation is. But foliar applications are our most efficient way, especially with any micronutrient. So when we see situations like this, when we have a history of this is going to be something we recommend to the grower, that they supply that nutrition going forward. So if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to your local ASA or any of us on the PCT team. I'm Jonah Johnson for JJ in the Field. Thanks for watching.